Hey there folks, welcome to the channel. I'm glad you could be here. If this is the first video that you've seen from our channel, let me just start off by saying that this particular video is not necessarily indicative of the type of videos that we make. This video is actually part 3 in a series that we created where we had to fix the refrigerant leak in our Harvest Right freeze dryer. Part 1 dealt with my interaction with Harvest Right, Part 2 dealt with us trying to find the leak, and this episode, Part 3, is basically going to deal with the ultra technical stuff. If you are super curious, just like me, or if you're into the heating, air conditioning, or refrigeration profession, stick around. I'd love to hear your feedback after this video is over. If you have any suggestions as to what we could have done differently or better, I'd love to hear it, and I'm always looking to learn and improve, and this was one heck of a project. All right, so the idea for the video that I had to do what we did basically began when I noticed that the freeze dryer acted differently under certain loads. When it was completely empty and just freezing, it would act one way, right? The frost pattern would go from the back all the way to the front, generally without any problem. But the moment the vacuum kicked on, the moment there was food in there, and the moment the heating pads by the food started to turn off and on, the machine started to act differently. It seemed like less refrigerant was being metered into the evaporator. And so in my mind, I thought, I wonder if that's the most efficient way or the most effective way to build a freeze dryer. And the goal for this particular project was to create a freeze dryer that hopefully would freeze faster and freeze dry more efficiently, right? And I kind of wanted that to be, you know, something we could quantifiably measure, because none of these parts were cheap. After it was all said and done, we probably have $800, $1,000 in parts in this freeze dryer. Let's take a look at the parts right quick, and I have got to give 100% credit to Superior Air out in Visalia, California. Larry Kapigian graciously provided all the parts for this video and put me through a crash course in refrigeration, so thank you, Larry. All right, let's go over the components. The first component is a thermal expansion valve, which is literally going to replace the capillary tube. There is a cartridge that goes right inside there that I didn't show, but hopefully this particular piece will give us better control as to the amount of refrigerant going into the evaporator. Being that we're more than likely going to be flooding the evaporator with liquid refrigerant, we need a suction accumulator to catch any of that excess liquid refrigerant, because of course we don't want to damage the compressor, and this piece is almost exclusively there to protect the compressor. Another piece that we're going to be adding to protect the compressor is a CPR, or a crankcase pressure regulator, because the pressure on the evaporator side is going to be relatively high, and that could damage our compressor, seize it up, so on and so forth. And so this little piece is designed to regulate the pressure coming out of the evaporator. Basically, no matter what the pressure is on the evaporator side, the exit pressure going into the compressor is going to be roughly about 15 psi. And so that should protect the compressor on that end. Of course, I could have put the exact same amount of coils around the drum, added the cap tube, and had this unit back in working order, honestly, in a day. But what's the fun of that, right? So the first thing I had to do was get nitrogen. Nitrogen is complicated to get over here. It's one of those gases that's almost exclusively reserved for welding. And so I had to get this huge tank of nitrogen delivered out to the house. And we had to also figure out the idea of what I was going to do with a vacuum pump, right? Because I did feel like this particular unit had a lot of moisture in it. When we originally took it all apart, the pieces that were cut were left open, and I live in an extremely super humid environment, and it didn't even dawn on me to close that up. And so I think there's a lot of moisture in the system. We need a vacuum pump to kind of evac all that stuff, and we need to start off with a completely clean system. So the first obstacle was obtaining a vacuum pump. I didn't want to have to go out and buy one. And so let me show you what I did to kind of make what I had already work for me. This is the Stay Fresh Freeze Dryer's vacuum pump. And I use this pump because it happens to have a KF25 fitting, which I found to be easier to retrofit. The Harvest Right vacuum pump uses a JIC fitting, and it just got completely out of control. And so I bought a couple components off of Amazon to make that happen. One was a KF25 gasket. This is a KF25 NPT 3/8 inch male, and I'm going to be connecting that to a 3/8 inch flare adapter, and it worked perfectly. I couldn't be happier. So we're going to connect that onto the vacuum pump and then connect our vacuum hose to that flare, and we are good to go. All right, we've got our pump ready to go. before we get into the really technical stuff, this is by no means a tutorial, right? This is just some YouTuber playing around after getting a crash course in refrigeration. And so if you're working on a Harvest Right freeze dryer, I certainly do not recommend you make the modifications that we made. Matter of fact, at the end of part 2, I think I tried to make it explicitly clear that if I had to do this all over again, I would not do this, because for the amount of money that we spent on this particular project, I was actually hoping for something much bigger, and I got something much smaller. And so after it's all said and done, I think keeping the design of the unit with the capillary tube is probably the best for this particular system, because when it's working the way that it should, you know, barring 15 leaks in the evaporator, it actually does what it's supposed to do. So if I had to do it all over again, I would just make it look exactly the way that it did from factory. And so this is just us having a good time. I want you guys to take note. If there's anything that you would do differently, like I said in the beginning of this video, drop me a comment in the comment section below. This is basically my prototype play machine at this particular point. There are a couple things that I think I am going to change, like the cartridge in the TXV. I have a AAA cartridge inside the TXV that we use from Sporlan, and I believe we sized that based off of the compressor that we have. And as of right now, and I probably will be getting it tomorrow or the next day, I've ordered the AA cartridge. I wanted to see if I can use something a little bit bigger so we can meter more refrigerant into the evaporator without having to open that TXV all the way up. And so that's kind of the idea. I did reach out to Sporlan. Those guys are absolutely amazing, super helpful. And for someone who doesn't know a whole lot about refrigeration, they were able to give me just a ton of insight as to whether or not it will work. And obviously, the guy was like, everybody says, in theory. So this guy's like, in theory, it should work. At this point, I have nothing to lose, and it's already on order. So I am going to be putting a AA cartridge inside that TXV to see if I can get it even colder, even faster. But that's neither here nor there. At this point, we are ready to hook up the manifold, do a pressure test, and kind of proceed with all the different steps in order to get our freeze dryer ready for refrigerant. And wow, I gotta be honest, man, for someone who's, this is the first time I've ever done it, there are a lot of steps that you gotta kind of keep in mind. And so I know you guys who do this for a profession, mad respect. All right, let's get started with a pressure test. Hooking up the nitrogen tank, and we're gonna use our refrigerant charging hose for this. This is our setup as of right now. We've got the Stay Fresh pump at the bottom. All of my hoses are connected. We got the high and low side. CPR connected right there between the accumulator and the compressor. There's the TXV, and we do have the sensing bulb already insulated with a little cork tape as that line exits the evaporator going into the accumulator. There's my sight glass, and right above it we've got a new filter dryer, nice big dryer right there on top. And then, of course, I've got a separate micron gauge just to kind of compare it to what the filled piece manifold tells me in the event that one's off. Okay, the system has equalized. We've run a nitrogen pressure test at 300 psi for about 15 minutes or so, and it looks like we are good to go. So we're going to release that pressure now. And now it's time for a vacuum decay test. A lot of different ways you could do this, but we're going to be incorporating the triple evac method, which means we are going to put the system under vacuum 3 times. We're going to open up both the low and the high side port. The nitrogen line is closed, and we're going to turn on our vacuum. And as you can see right here, we're down to about 950 microns. At this point, I'm going to turn off the pump and break that vacuum with nitrogen. I'm going to increase the pressure inside the chamber to about 20 psi, give or take, and let it hang out there for about 5 minutes. We're going to do this basically 3 times. And each time we do this, it's going to pull any non-condensables, any moisture from the system, and it's going to allow us to pull a stronger vacuum faster. Okay, so what you just saw was the first time that we did it. We did do that 2 more times, and we're now on the final stage of pulling a vacuum, in which point we're going to pull a pretty deep vacuum. And this is what that looks like after just a short period of time. We're down to 122 microns. Okay, so at this point, we need to do a vacuum decay test just to make sure that there's nothing in our system that we need to be concerned about. Remember, all we want is refrigerant in this system. Right now, we're at 122, and the goal here is to keep it under 1,000 microns for less than 10 minutes. Ideally, I'd like to keep it under 500 microns for less than 10 minutes, and if we are able to accomplish that, we can move on to the next step, which is adding refrigerant to the system. All right, while we're at it, let's go ahead and take a look at our other micron gauge,
and it looks like we are at 130 microns, which is pretty close to the other one. So those are pretty similar, not that big of a difference between the two. And here's how we do a decay test. We are going to keep the high and low side open. We are going to close the vacuum port and turn off the vacuum, at which point we're going to set a 10-minute timer and monitor both gauges. We're going to time lapse this so it doesn't take forever, but you can see what's going on with the manifold and you can see what's going on with the external gauge that we've got going on over there. And they're both reading pretty similar, not too far off. Our 10-minute timer is up and it looks like both gauges came in under 500 micron. Absolutely perfect. Very pleased with that. Let's proceed. All right, now we need to add refrigerant, and just so you know, in the event that you were curious, this 25-pound container cost me only $80. That's refrigerant R410A. Pretty sweet, right? Now that our refrigerant's hooked up, I've purged the nitrogen out of the lines using the vapor from the refrigerant tank, at which point we're now going to turn our tank upside down and slowly meter about 4 or 5 ounces of liquid refrigerant into the system, which is a little less than half of what we need. We're going to turn our system on and start to monitor the pressure and temperature. We do need to add a couple temperature sensors, though, to the line. The first one is going to be our suction line temperature. That's going to go right here as it exits the evaporator. And the second sensor is going to be our liquid line temperature, and that's going to be attached right here as the line exits our condenser. All right, so there we go. We're going to plug those two into the system, and let's get it going. All right, guys, we are back in business, and it's now time to get into the test mode by pressing the Harvest Right logo. This is going to basically open up the functional testing, and we want to press the pressure freeze option. That's going to kick on the compressor, and the unit's going to start freezing. So at this point, we need to look at our gauges and just monitor our pressures and temperatures. At this stage, though, I got to admit, it's still super early. We just turned the unit on, and we want to let it stabilize. So we're going to let it run for about half an hour before we actually start to make any decision as to whether or not we want to add more refrigerant or make any changes to the thermal expansion valve, things like that. I do want to take a look at the chamber and notice how it freezes, right? So we're not getting a back to forward type of freezing. It's actually freezing all at one time, which is super encouraging. Great frost pattern. And now remember, we don't have the full amount of refrigerant that's necessary. We are going to be making that adjustment here in a second, but as of right now, beautiful frost pattern front to back. Everything looks amazing. Let's look at our gauges and see what that's telling us. And at a glance, let me just kind of let you know what I'm reading. Outside temperature is 74, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. My liquid line temperature, that's this number right here. Sorry about the autofocus. That's 83.1. And my suction line temperature is 15.4 degrees. That's a little higher than I'm actually shooting for. I'm shooting for closer to about -30, -35. My high side, which is this section over here, is reading basically 273 pressure with a 5.9 degree subcooling. And honestly, I have no idea what the subcooling should be. I couldn't find that information anywhere. So we're going to just kind of shoot for a 10 degree subcooling and check the sight glass and get it to run clear. My low side, which is this side right here, is reading basically a 59 degree superheat, which is a little higher than I want. Remember, I want this down to about -35. And so the pressure, the refrigerant, which is R410A, and then of course the temperature of that refrigerant coming out of the line all plays a factor in what the superheat is going to be. And so we want to target probably a 20-25 superheat, but once again, I have absolutely no idea. So we're just going to kind of monitor it and see how it runs. This is what the sight glass looks like. And as you can see, it kind of looks like there's vapor and liquid inside the sight glass. And under ideal circumstances, I want it to run clear. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little more refrigerant to the low side. And I'm just going to barely crack open that low side port because we don't want to overload liquid refrigerant into the compressor. As far as the refrigerant knob, we're just going to open that for a quick second and then very quickly close it. And I'm just going to be listening to the sounds of the compressor, monitoring the gauge as well. Let's do it one more time, very quickly. And what I don't want is to hear a change in the way the compressor sounds. That's letting me know that I'm putting too much liquid refrigerant into the compressor, and that is not good. So very quick spurts, just metering in a tiny bit at a time. Let's take a look at the sight glass one more time. Notice how it looks completely clear. And although I have a light next to it, the color of that sight glass is a little misleading. This is what it looks like without the light on. So we've got a very dry system. At this point, our subcooling has increased to roughly about 9 degrees, which is a little closer to what I'm looking for. I may add just a touch more refrigerant, get it kind of around that 10 degree number. And then if you look at our superheat, we're still pretty high, coming in at 57 degrees. And that's because our suction line temperature is relatively high. I need that to get lower. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to just make a quick adjustment to our thermal expansion valve. Now what we're doing here is we're basically opening up that valve so more liquid refrigerant can enter into the evaporator, which is going to automatically make it colder. Now that's also one of the main reasons why we have a suction accumulator, and so any excess liquid refrigerant is going to get trapped in there to protect the compressor, because we just want vapor into the compressor. So let's give this a couple turns and see what happens. Now normally I'll make an adjustment and then I'll wait a little while to see what the readings look like once it's stabilized a little bit, and it's now been a little while later, and it looks like we're moving in the right direction. Check out our subcooling. We've got 11 degree subcooling. Our suction line temperature is cranking at a -30, -35 Fahrenheit. We've got a great VSAT at -54, and there's my superheat. So that's kind of what I was targeting with the superheat, somewhere between 20 and 25, and it looks like we are definitely there. All right, so now that our system is running basically the way that we want, we've got a good subcooling, we've got a good superheat, the right amount of refrigerant is in the system. I'm going to run a full load, monitor it, probably do it a couple different times, but for this video, we are done.
All right, guys, there you have it. That's what I had to do to get my freeze dryer up and running. And like I said earlier, I do want to increase the size of the cartridge because the coldest I could get the suction line temperature was about -38, -40 degrees Fahrenheit. And although it froze radically faster than it did with the capillary tube, I do think if I can get that temperature down even lower, maybe -45, then we'll be even better in business. And I basically had the TXV completely wide open. You know, I think in the video I just showed like a half a turn or something like that, but I had this thing completely wide open. I think from zero I had 8 full turns, and you kind of max it out at 8 turns, and that's what gave me that -35, -38. My superheat ended up being somewhere around 23 average. It did fluctuate between 25 and 20, kind of in that range. And then my subcooling kind of averaged out between 10.5, 10.8, something like that, which I was happy with. Overall, the machine is working brilliantly. The problem is that it just costs way too much money to get it to do what it did. I mean, the performance isn't exponentially better. The amount of money that we put into it is basically a third of what the entire machine cost me brand new. So, like I said in the beginning, totally not worth it. If you are out there working on freeze dryers, you will not have to deal with any of this stuff. I mean, this is a critically charged system. I want to say that it uses 7.5 ounces of refrigerant, R410A, to get it where it needs to go. And the condenser, the compressor, and the evaporator system are actually pretty simple from the factory. There's really not a whole lot going on. If you haven't seen part 2, definitely check out part 2. Thanks a lot, guys, for watching this video. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, or if you have any suggestions or better ideas as to what I could have done to make this work even better, leave them in the comment section below. I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Thanks for being a part of this channel. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.